This PowerPoint will introduce you to some of the elements of a visual that help us create meaning. And we're going to apply that in particular to an advertisement because that's what you'll be writing your second essay about. So when we think about a visual, we have to think about reading it in the same way that we would read a text. Even though we're not necessarily just reading for words, there are a lot of parts of those images that make meaning and contribute to how we understand the overall meaning of an image. And these are things that you might commonly take for granted. You may not be thinking about these different elements and how they're helping you understand an image. But images are all around us. They're everywhere. Advertisements are everywhere. So it's really important that we can step back and think about how are they trying to do what they're doing? How are they creating meaning in the image and in the advertisements that we're seeing? So this kind of a visual analysis that you'll be writing your paper about is going to help you to really step back and consider them. Anytime we look at a visual, there's a lot of different parts that we're looking at to think about that, but we always want to be putting them back together as a whole. Hopefully that'll start to sound really familiar to you as you think about it in analysis. Analysis always is taking something together and taking something apart into its parts and then putting it back together into a whole. So we're trying to understand how these pieces of an image work together to make meaning. When you're thinking about an advertisement, it's always doing more than just selling the product. That's not going to be enough for this essay. We have to understand how the ad is selling the product. And usually what that means is we're going to connect it to a bigger concept, a bigger image, an idea, a feeling, an adjective, something that all the different pieces or elements of the visual are doing and working together. So one thing we want to always consider is color. Can you think about different ways that color makes meaning? Maybe one way we could think about that is different colors represent different things. Thinking about what the color black tends to represent. Maybe evil, maybe power, maybe mystery. White tends to represent purity, goodness. Red can represent anger or passion or love, violence. So these different kind of colors are ones that we've come to associate with different things. It doesn't mean that they necessarily mean those things, but we've come to associate them with those things, and so advertisers know that, and they're going to use those colors in a particular way. Red and yellow tend to be the most attention-grabbing colors. It's no mistake that those are the colors that McDonald's uses. So look for those colors as well if they're trying to catch your attention. And you can also think about anytime an image is in black and white, what does that choice mean? I think we tend to read those images as more classic, more sophisticated, perhaps, more timeless as we're thinking about that. Advertisers know that, and they're going to use that. So we're going to use this Taylor Swift Wonderstruck perfume ad throughout this PowerPoint to kind of demonstrate some of these different elements. So as I look at this advertisement, I'm really struck with kind of the natural or neutral tones, first of all. That kind of overall neutral palette makes me feel like it's supposed to feel natural and comfortable, easy. Looking at the light pink color of her dress, I think light pink is a color that we read as very feminine. It's a color we think about young girls. Definitely a princess comes to mind as I think about a color like that. The green in the background and the brown, sort of that lush, natural kind of colors. I think that purple in the bottle over here is something we want to think about in terms of royalty. Again, princesses, purple tends to represent royalty. It's also really bright, sticks out in there. And gold is a color that I think we associate with wealth, with prosperity, perhaps with royalty as well. So after we've kind of thought about colors, how they work, we want to think about the layout of an image. And our eyes read a visual in the same way that we read text, from top left to bottom right. And you can think about in terms of that your attention is always your eyes are always going to gravitate to the top left first. If that's a blank space, it's going to move towards the middle, and it's going to end on the bottom right. So generally in an image, we tend to see things in the top left and in the center as the most important to us. That's something you want to think about in terms of layout. It's no mistake that on a cigarette advertisement, for example, the little warning label is going to be probably in the bottom right corner of it. It's going to try and hide it as a less important place for our eyes to look. It's never going to be in the center of an image. We also want to think about the background or the setting of the image. What's in the foreground? What's in the background? How do those things contribute to meaning? Usually we read things in the foreground as more important than those in the background. So we want to pay attention to that. So now as we look at the Taylor Swift image again, we can think about that in terms of layout. So we can see that Taylor Swift is over here. This is going to be a split page in a magazine, so she's right in the center of the right side page. The perfume is right in the center of the left side page. So we read those things as important, both who is making it and what the actual perfume is, the product. It's going to be important. We can also see the background is that natural setting, the kind of almost a forest setting. We want to think about how maybe that contributes. But what's in the foreground, things that are important to us are, again, Taylor and the bottle. Those are the things that we read as most important because they're closest to us. We have sort of this thing on the bottom corner, and then you can see that slogan is kind of towards the bottom, something that we read as the least important part of that image. Another thing we want to consider in terms of reading a visual is size, relative size of objects. We tend to read things that are bigger as more important. That's something that we've kind of been taught to do. If something is bigger on a page, it's more important. We make a title a bigger size, it's more important, something to catch attention. Smaller tends to mean less important. So you always want to think about the relationship between objects that you're seeing on a page as you do that. Interestingly, I mentioned cigarette advertisements before. There's actually rules about how big that warning label has to be on an advertisement so that they don't make it really tiny and difficult to read. Looking at this Taylor Swift image, I'm struck with two giant things on this page in relative size. First of all, Taylor Swift is giant. She's the biggest thing on that page, so I read that as really important. That dress is incredibly important. It seems like it's a giant dress. It's one I read as sort of like a princess dress or a ball gown, something like that. And then I have this image over here of the perfume bottle, which is also really large, relatively speaking. You can see in terms of Taylor how much bigger that is. So we're meant to read those as important. We can also see these goofy chandeliers in the background. I didn't mention that in the background section. But as I look at them, this one is really big too. So I'm somehow supposed to think that the fact that there's this giant chandelier in the middle of the forest is really important. And I'm starting to connect that to ideas of maybe fairy tale, fantasy, wealth, something like that as we think about it. Princess, perhaps. See, the smallest thing again is this small tagline, the beginning of something magical, but the Wonderstruck actual image is much bigger. The text of an image is really important. We have to think about how they work together in relationship to the image. Sometimes text in a visual, especially in advertisement, is really important. Sometimes they're not. But we got to think about both the choice of language, the actual words chosen, and how they affect meaning. And you can always think, if different words have been chosen, would that change the meaning of the advertisement? And then you also want to think about what kind of fonts, colors, styles are used to display that text, and what kind of a meaning it's trying to make with it. Fonts can do a lot to kind of set a tone or set a mood that we don't always think about, as does color, as we've already discussed. So looking at this Taylor Swift ad, it says, a new fragrance, Wonderstruck, the beginning of something magical. To me, this word magical is really important. It seems to be fitting in with this ball gown, this sort of princess-like effect of her being a young girl, this very elaborate dress, the goofiness of these chandeliers in the background in the middle of a forest. It really strikes me as fairy tale, seems to be fitting with it. The choice of gold to use here seems really meaningful too. Again, going on that fantasy, fairy tale, wealth, princess, royalty seems to fit. And even this kind of W in the Wonderstruck has a lot of fantasy appeal to it, fairy tale-like effect. So it seems all very intentional, the use of text in here. The location, target audience is really important to consider when we think about an image, especially an advertisement. Who is it meant for? And because it's meant for a particular audience, how does that help us read it? a certain audience is always going to be targeted in advertisements. They spend millions of dollars on them, so they want to make sure the right people are getting it. So we want to make sure we're understanding what that might mean. So for an image like this, I'm going to guess that this is found in a women's magazine, probably a younger women's magazine, probably for a younger audience. I think the kind of young effect of the princess-like thing, I think Taylor Swift tends to appeal to younger audiences. And I think this is definitely meant for women. It seems to appeal to a female audience to me. You can disagree if you like, but that's how I read it. And then the last thing we want to think about anytime we're talking about an image is its purpose. What is it meant to do? So an advertisement is always trying to sell something. It's always trying to get you to do something. It always has a persuasive message. And so we want to read it that way. We want to be able to understand how it's trying to persuade us so that we can make an informed decision for ourselves. It's trying to sell the perfume, trying to make it seem interesting or unique, set it apart to other things. It's also trying to kind of push the Taylor Swift image and the brand of her to people who like her music or follow her in other places, maybe appealed to purchase this perfume from that way. It always has a purpose. So all those pieces are really great. We've talked about color, we've talked about the font, we've talked about the text, we've talked about the layout, we've talked about size, but that's not enough for an essay like this. For an essay like this to be successful, you have to put those things back together and try and understand how it's trying to sell the image. So a weak thesis statement for an essay like this would say, this Taylor Swift ad is trying to sell perfume. That's too obvious, it's too basic. What we'd want to do is we'd want to connect that to a bigger thing now that we've looked at all those pieces. So for me, this perfume is trying to sell its perfume by connecting it to an idea of fantasy or fairy tale, a young girl's desire for fantasy and fairy tale. And there's a lot of pieces of that we could talk about, right? We talked about how the color is sort of fantastic. I'm sorry, the font here is sort of a fantastic fantasy-like thing. The colors, to me, all are reminiscent of royalty. Princess, that's a fantasy of a lot of little girls. The fact that we've got these chandeliers in the very natural background, very fantastic. It doesn't happen in real life. Her ball gown, her big dress with the kind of silver rhinestones and things, to me seems like it's a princess type outfit. The light pink, something that's appealing to young girls. Again, princess, fairy tale, fantasy, all seems to be working together for me as I read this ad. And even the tagline, the beginning of something magical. Magic, fairy tale, fantasy. Those all seem to fit together to me really clearly in that. So putting them together in that way is going to be a much, much stronger way to attack this essay. It's going to be a much stronger thesis statement to say that it's connected to those things. And then you can break it down in pieces, how each one of those elements that we've talked about fits back together with that overall message. So I hope that kind of helped you think about an image in a different way, maybe in a way you haven't thought about before, in particular an advertisement. And I hope it kind of inspires you as you start picking out your own advertisement and looking at them to find one that seems to have a lot going on and seems to be really appealing to something in a reader to get them, or a viewer, to get them to purchase the item. An advertisement is never just trying to sell something. It always has a purpose or a way that it's trying to sell them, and that's going to be your job for this. All right, good luck. Happy writing.